The first whisper of scandal did not begin with a raised voice, nor with a careless misstep upon the polished floor, but with a glance, swift, deliberate, and so carefully concealed that only one pair of eyes in the entire glittering assembly thought to follow it. The ballroom shimmered beneath a galaxy of chandeliers, each crystal trembling with candlelight as though the very air were alive with secrets, and beneath that golden glow the nobility of London gathered in silks and satins, their laughter measured, their smiles precise, their every gesture performed with the practiced elegance of those who understood that reputation was both armor and weapon. Musicians coaxed a soft melody from their instruments, the notes floating like perfume through the crowded space, while footmen moved in quiet efficiency, bearing trays of wine that glowed like garnets in the light. At the far edge of this spectacle stood Eliza Harrow, her posture composed, her expression carefully neutral, her presence acknowledged by no one who mattered and yet required by everyone who did. As a lady's companion, she existed in that peculiar space between servant and gentlewoman, permitted proximity but denied participation, trusted with secrets yet never entrusted with consequence. Her gown was modest, her gloves plain, her voice rarely used except in service, and yet her eyes missed very little. It was those eyes, observant and unassuming, that caught the moment others overlooked. A viscount, once favored, now whispered about with polite disdain, paused beside a column, his smile strained, his movements carrying the faint stiffness of a man conscious of being watched. Near him stood a footman whose composure wavered just enough to betray unease, his grip tightening on a silver tray as though it might steady him. Their exchange lasted no more than a heartbeat, a murmur too soft to be heard, a glance too fleeting to be questioned, and then a subtle adjustment of the decanter upon the tray. It was nothing. It was everything. Eliza's gaze lingered, her instincts stirring with a quiet urgency she could not immediately name, and as the footman moved away, threading through the crowd with careful precision, she found herself watching the path he took. He did not wander aimlessly, nor did he pause to offer his tray to those who might expect it. Instead, he moved with purpose toward a single figure, one whose presence commanded attention even in a room overflowing with rank. The Duke of Ashbourne stood near the center of the ballroom, engaged in conversation yet never fully given to it, his expression composed in that particular manner of men accustomed to scrutiny. He was young for his station, yet there was nothing untested in his bearing. His years in Parliament had sharpened his reserve, had taught him the art of listening without revealing, of observing without appearing to do so. His dark coat fit him with effortless precision, his posture unyielding, and though others leaned toward him with eager deference, he remained slightly apart, as though some invisible boundary set him beyond their reach. The footman approached. The tray tilted, ever so slightly. A glass was selected, filled with wine drawn from the decanter that had been so carefully placed. Eliza felt the shift within herself then, the quiet certainty that something was amiss settling with the weight of inevitability, and though reason urged caution, though propriety demanded silence, instinct rose sharper, louder, impossible to ignore. She moved. It was not a graceful decision, nor a calculated one, but a swift crossing of space that seemed, in retrospect, to fracture the careful order of the room. She passed unnoticed at first, as she always did, slipping between conversations and silks, her steps light, her presence unremarked, until she stood within reach of the Duke himself. He turned slightly as she approached, his attention drawn not by her rank, which was negligible, but by the certainty of her movement, and in that brief moment their eyes met, hers steady, his questioning, both suspended in a silence that seemed to press against the edges of the world. She leaned closer, her voice barely more than breath. "Don't drink that." The words, though soft, carried the force of something irrevocable, and before hesitation could claim her, before doubt could reclaim its hold, she acted. Her hand struck the glass. Wine spilled in a sudden arc of crimson, staining silk, splashing across the polished floor, the sound of shattering crystal cutting through the music like a blade. For one suspended instant, the room forgot how to breathe. Then came the gasp. It rippled outward, a collective intake of shock and outrage, as though the entire assembly had been struck by the same invisible blow, and all eyes turned toward the source of the disruption. Conversations faltered, fans stilled mid-motion, and the musicians, uncertain, allowed their melody to dissolve into silence. Eliza stood motionless, the enormity of her actions settling upon her with a clarity that was almost serene, and she felt, rather than saw, the weight of judgment descend. She had crossed a boundary that could not be uncrossed, had committed a breach so profound that explanation might not suffice to mend it. A lady's companion did not touch a duke. A lady's companion did not interrupt a moment of such public visibility. A lady's companion did not exist loudly enough to be noticed at all. Yet she had done all three. Her employer's voice reached her first, sharp with mortification, though she could not bring herself to turn toward it, and around her the whispers began, swift and merciless, shaping speculation into condemnation with practiced ease. Improper. Quite mad. Ambitious, no doubt. And still she did not move. Because the Duke had not released her hand. She had not realized, in the chaos of the moment, that her action had drawn them into contact, that her gloved fingers had brushed his, that the proximity she had forced now lingered in a way that no propriety could excuse, and yet he did not step back, did not withdraw, did not call for reprimand or explanation. Instead, he looked at her. Not with anger. Not with shock. But with something far more unsettling. Consideration. The room watched, breath held once more, as the seconds stretched, as expectation built toward the inevitable rebuke, and then, with a deliberateness that could not be mistaken, he tightened his hold just enough to be seen. "I trust you." The words fell softly, yet they carried across the silence with unmistakable clarity, their meaning striking deeper than any raised voice could have managed, and in their wake came a second wave of astonishment, sharper than the first. Given not to an equal, nor to an ally, but to a woman who had just publicly shamed him. Eliza felt the shift immediately, the nature of her disgrace transforming into something more dangerous, more complicated, as the room recalibrated its judgment. She was no longer merely foolish, she was inexplicable. And inexplicability invited scrutiny. The Duke released her then, not abruptly, but with the same measured control he applied to all things, and as he did, he turned his gaze briefly toward the shattered glass, toward the dark stains spreading across the floor, before lifting his eyes once more to meet hers. There was no gratitude in his expression, no reassurance, only a quiet, searching intensity, as though he weighed not only her action, but the reason behind it, and in that moment Eliza understood something that sent a chill through her composure. He had not been surprised. Around them, the world began to move again, though its rhythm had changed, its harmony disrupted beyond easy repair, and as attendants hurried to clear the broken glass, as voices rose in cautious attempts to restore normalcy, Eliza felt the inevitability of consequence close around her. She would be dismissed. Perhaps tonight. Perhaps before she could even return to her employer's side. Her position, fragile to begin with, had been shattered as surely as the glass at her feet. And yet, as she was guided away, as the whispers followed her like shadows, she could not silence the thought that lingered, insistent and unresolved. If the danger had been real, if her instinct had been right, then the act itself was not the end of the matter. It was the beginning. And somewhere behind her, beneath the glittering chandeliers and the watchful eyes of society, the Duke of Ashbourne remained standing, untouched by the wine that might have undone him, his gaze no longer upon the crowd, but fixed instead upon the space she had left behind, as though the true disturbance of the evening had yet to reveal its full design. Morning did not arrive gently for Eliza Harrow. It came instead with the brittle clarity of consequence, carried on the hushed urgency of servants who knew scandal when it brushed too close to their own precarious lives. The townhouse, so radiant the night before, now seemed altered, its grandeur stripped of warmth, its corridors echoing with whispers that clung to the walls like damp. Doors closed more quickly when she passed, conversations thinned into silence, and though no one spoke her name outright, she felt it moving ahead of her, shaping expectation into quiet condemnation. She had not slept. The image of shattered crystal and spilled wine lingered behind her eyes, replaying itself with merciless precision, each detail sharper in recollection than it had been in the moment. Yet it was not her own humiliation that returned most insistently, but the Duke's voice, measured and unyielding, those 3 words spoken not in haste but in certainty. "I trust you." They had altered everything, not by absolving her, but by placing her under a scrutiny far more dangerous than dismissal. Her employer summoned her shortly after dawn, the interview brief and devoid of kindness, though it was conducted with all the outward civility expected of the rank. Eliza stood with her hands folded, her posture unassailable, while her future was discussed as though it were an inconvenience rather than a life. Questions were asked, answers given, yet no explanation seemed sufficient to counterbalance the impropriety of her actions. It was not merely that she had erred, it was that she had done so publicly, irreparably, before witnesses who would not forget. "You have placed me in an intolerable position," her employer concluded, her voice trembling with restrained displeasure. "And yet, there has been communication." Eliza lifted her gaze then, unable to disguise her surprise. "A message arrived not an hour ago," the lady continued, each word chosen with care. "From His Grace, the Duke of Ashbourne. He has requested your presence." The words did not bring relief. They brought uncertainty of a deeper kind, one that settled uneasily beneath her composure. A summons from a duke was no simple matter, particularly not under such circumstances, and though she inclined her head in acknowledgement, she could not quiet the instinct that warned her this was no gesture of leniency. She was escorted not to a public receiving room, but to a private study set apart from the main household, where the air carried the faint scent of extinguished candle smoke and polished wood. It was a masculine space, restrained in its elegance, designed for thought rather than display, and within it the Duke stood by the window, his back turned as though he had been waiting not for minutes, but for something far longer. He did not turn immediately when she entered, and in that pause she was afforded a moment to observe him without consequence. There was a stillness to him that did not suggest ease, but control, the kind forged through necessity rather than inclination, and she understood, with a clarity that unsettled her, that whatever composure he displayed was not innate but constructed. "You may leave us," he said quietly, addressing the servant who had escorted her, and only when the door closed behind them did he turn. His gaze found hers without hesitation, and though it was not unkind, it was exacting, as though he sought not merely to see her, but to understand the measure of her. "You acted with certainty last night," he said, dispensing with formalities. "I should like to know upon what it was founded." There was no accusation in his tone, yet neither was there indulgence, and Eliza felt the weight of the question settle upon her with unmistakable intent. He was not seeking reassurance, he was seeking truth. "I observed an exchange, Your Grace," she replied, her voice steady despite the tension that threaded through her, "between a gentleman and a footman. It appeared deliberate." "Deliberate," he repeated, as though testing the word for weakness. "And from that you concluded the wine was unsafe." "I concluded it might be," she said, choosing her words with care. "And that hesitation would render the knowledge useless." A flicker of something crossed his expression then, not quite approval, but not dismissal either, and he moved away from the window, closing the distance between them with a quiet decisiveness that altered the space itself. "You have no proof," he said. "No, Your Grace." "And yet you acted." "Yes." The silence that followed was not empty, but weighted, each second stretching as though it might reveal something neither had yet spoken, and when he finally inclined his head, it was with a consideration that felt almost reluctant. "Then we are in agreement," he said. There was intent. The words settled between them with quiet finality, transforming suspicion into something far more dangerous, and Eliza felt the implications unfold with a clarity that left little room for doubt. This was no misunderstanding, no unfortunate coincidence that might be dismissed with time. It was an act designed, and it had failed only because she had intervened. "Why tell me this?" she asked before she could restrain herself. His gaze sharpened slightly, though his expression remained composed. "Because you are already involved," he replied, "whether by choice or by consequence." The truth of it struck with uncomfortable force, and she could not deny it, though she might wish to. Her action had drawn her into something far beyond her station, something that would not release her simply because she lacked the rank to withstand it. He crossed to his desk then, selecting something small from its surface, and when he returned, he held it out to her without explanation. It was a narrow strip of ribbon, dark and unassuming, bearing a seal impressed so faintly it might have gone unnoticed to any but the most attentive eye. "This was found upon the decanter," he said. "It does not belong to my household." Eliza accepted it carefully, aware that even this small gesture carried weight, and as her fingers brushed his, she felt the echo of the previous night linger in the contact, unspoken yet undeniable. "You wish me to recognize it?" she said. "I wish to know if you do." She studied it for a moment, her thoughts moving swiftly, though no immediate recognition presented itself, and when she shook her head, she felt a flicker of disappointment that she could not entirely justify. "No, Your Grace." "Then you will keep it?" he said. The instruction caught her off guard. "I beg your pardon?" "You will keep it," he repeated, his tone leaving no room for refusal. "And if you see its likeness again, you will inform me." The implication was clear, and with it came a realization that settled uneasily within her. He was not merely questioning her. He was employing her, not formally, not openly, but in a manner that placed her in quiet alignment with his purpose. "Your Grace," she began, the caution she had thus far maintained slipping slightly, "this is not a role I am suited to." "No," he agreed, cutting her off with a calm that bordered on finality. "It is not. Which is precisely why it may succeed." The logic, though unsettling, held its own kind of clarity, and Eliza found herself unable to counter it, though the cost of such involvement was not lost on her. Her position was already compromised. Further entanglement could only deepen the risk. "And my reputation?" she asked quietly. His gaze did not soften, but something within it shifted, as though he acknowledged the weight of her question without fully yielding to it. "It was placed in question the moment you acted," he said. "What remains of it will depend not on silence but on outcome." The honesty of it struck deeper than reassurance might have done, and she inclined her head, accepting what could not be altered. "Then I will observe," she said. "Do so carefully," he replied. A knock sounded at the door then, sharp enough to fracture the fragile equilibrium of the room, and when it opened, a servant entered with a composure that did not quite conceal urgency. "Your Grace," he said, bowing slightly, "there has been another incident." The words fell with quiet weight, and Eliza felt the shift immediately, the fragile sense of control giving way to something more volatile. "In what manner?" the Duke asked. "The kitchens, Your Grace. A vial was discovered among the provisions. It has been removed, but it was not meant to be found," the Duke finished. The servant inclined his head. "No, Your Grace." Silence followed, heavier now, charged with the certainty that the threat had not passed, that it had merely adapted, and as the servant withdrew, leaving them once more alone, Eliza felt the implications settle with chilling clarity. This was no singular act. It was a pattern. "You see now," the Duke said quietly, his gaze returning to hers with an intensity that left no room for doubt, "why I could not afford to dismiss your instinct." She did not answer immediately, for the truth of it had already taken root, altering not only her understanding of the previous night, but of what lay ahead. She had stepped beyond the boundaries of her station once. There would be no simple return. And as she closed her fingers around the ribbon, feeling the faint impression of the seal beneath her touch, she understood that whatever design had been set in motion had not yet revealed its full extent. It had only just begun to tighten. The days that followed did not unfold with the clarity of resolution, but with the quiet tightening of expectation, as though the world itself had drawn a breath it had not yet chosen to release. London continued in its habitual splendor, carriages rolled, invitations were delivered, candles were lit against the dim of winter afternoons, but beneath that polished surface ran a current of speculation that neither Eliza Harrow nor the Duke of Ashbourne could escape, no matter how carefully they conducted themselves. Eliza returned to her duties with outward composure, though the nature of those duties had shifted in ways both subtle and irreversible. She was watched now, not openly, but with that peculiar attentiveness reserved for those who had crossed an invisible boundary and survived. Servants paused when she entered a room, their conversations thinning into cautious silence, while her employer's manner toward her had cooled into something distant and precise, as though proximity itself had become a risk. Yet dismissal had not come, and in its absence lay a tension that neither comfort nor certainty could ease. She carried the ribbon always, concealed within the folds of her sleeve, its presence a quiet reminder of the unseen design in which she had become entangled. At times she would trace the faint impression of its seal, committing its pattern to memory, though no recognition came to her, only a growing awareness that such symbols did not belong to the careless or the impulsive, but to those who understood the value of discretion. The Duke did not summon her again immediately, and in that delay she found no relief, only a heightened awareness of his absence, as though the brief alignment of their purposes had altered the space between them in a way that silence could not entirely undo. Yet she observed, as she had agreed, and it was in observation that she began to discern the subtle fractures beneath the surface of the household. It was in the arrangement of trays, in the quiet substitutions made by hands that moved too quickly to be questioned, in the way certain servants avoided certain tasks while others assumed them without comment. No single detail stood alone as evidence, yet together they formed a pattern that resisted dismissal, and as the days passed, Eliza found herself navigating the corridors with a sharpened awareness, her gaze lingering where once it might have passed without notice. The discovery came not with spectacle, but with stillness. She stood in a lesser-used passage near the kitchens, a place where the air carried the mingled sense of preparation and fire, when she saw it, a strip of ribbon, discarded carelessly upon a narrow table, its dark surface catching the faint light in a way that drew her eye. It was not identical to the one she carried, yet the impression upon it bore the same faint mark, the same deliberate pressure that spoke of intent rather than ornament. Her breath stilled. She did not reach for it immediately, for instinct cautioned restraint, yet she could not turn away, and as she remained where she stood, another presence entered the passage, his step measured, his gaze lifting just long enough to register her before settling upon the object she had not yet touched. The Viscount. He paused, not close enough to invite conversation, yet not distant enough to deny association, and in the silence that followed, something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that required no introduction. His expression remained composed, though the strain beneath it had not lessened since the night of the banquet, and when he inclined his head, the gesture carried a politeness that felt almost deliberate in its restraint. "You have an eye for detail, Miss Harrow," he said, his tone even. Eliza did not return the courtesy of his ease. "I observe what is placed before me, my lord," she replied. "And what you observe, you act upon," he said, the faintest suggestion of a smile touching his lips. "It is a quality both admirable and inconvenient." The word lingered, its implication neither fully concealed nor entirely revealed, and Eliza felt the weight of it settle with quiet certainty. "This does not belong here," she said, allowing her gaze to return briefly to the ribbon. "No," he agreed. "It does not." He stepped closer then, not enough to breach propriety, but sufficient to alter the balance of the space, and as he did, his voice lowered, though there was no one else within earshot. "You have already interfered once," he said. "I wonder if you understand the cost of doing so again." The question was not asked in curiosity, but in warning, and though Eliza felt the instinctive pull of caution, she did not retreat. "I understand that silence may carry a greater cost," she said. His gaze sharpened, the composure he had maintained slipping just enough to reveal something colder beneath. "Then you are either very brave," he said, "or very foolish." "Perhaps both," she replied. For a moment, the tension between them held, neither yielding, neither advancing, and then, with a slight inclination of his head, he stepped back, the distance between them restored with the same deliberate control he had applied in approaching. "Take care, Miss Harrow," he said. "Not all consequences are immediate." He left then, his departure as measured as his arrival, and only when the sound of his steps had faded did Eliza allow herself to move. She reached for the ribbon, her fingers closing around it with a steadiness that belied the quickening of her pulse, and as she concealed it beside the other, she felt the pattern sharpen, its lines drawing closer to coherence. She did not hesitate in seeking the Duke. This time, she was not summoned. She requested audience, and though the impropriety of such a request might once have deterred her, necessity had altered her understanding of what could be risked and what must be done. When she was admitted to his presence, it was again within the quiet restraint of his study, the fire low, the light subdued, as though the room itself had been designed to contain what might otherwise escape. He looked up as she entered, his expression unreadable, yet his attention immediate. "You have found something?" he said. It was not a question. She stepped forward, placing the second ribbon upon his desk, its dark surface stark against the polished wood. "It was not concealed," she said. "It was left where it might be discovered." His gaze lingered upon it, then lifted to hers. "By whom?" "The Viscount," she replied. The words settled with quiet weight, and though his expression did not alter significantly, she saw the shift in his posture, the subtle tightening that suggested confirmation rather than surprise. "He spoke to you," the Duke said. "Yes." "And?" "He warned me," she said, "not to interfere again." A silence followed, deeper than those that had come before, and when the Duke moved, it was not toward the ribbon, but toward her, the distance between them closing with a deliberateness that echoed their first encounter. "Then we are beyond conjecture," he said. "We are within intent." Eliza met his gaze, her composure steady despite the gravity of his words. "What will you do?" she asked. He did not answer immediately, and in that pause she sensed the weight of calculation, the balance of risk and consequence that defined his world as surely as it had begun to define hers. "What I must," he said at last. "But not alone." The implication settled between them, unmistakable, and for a moment neither spoke, the silence filled with the unspoken acknowledgement of what had been set in motion. "You place much upon trust, Your Grace?" she said quietly. His gaze did not waver. "It was placed the moment you chose to act," he replied. The truth of it resonated with a clarity that left little room for doubt, and as she inclined her head, accepting what could no longer be refused, she felt the final boundary give way. Outside, the world continued its measured course, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge the design unfolding beneath its careful order, yet within that quiet room, something had shifted irrevocably. The lines between rank and insignificance, between observer and participant, had blurred beyond easy distinction, and in their place stood something far more precarious. An alliance. Not declared, not understood by those who would judge it, but no less real for its silence. And as the fire burned low, casting long shadows across the walls, Eliza understood with unyielding certainty that whatever resolution awaited them would not be found in avoidance or retreat, but in confrontation, and that the choice before them was no longer whether to act, but how far they were willing to go once they did.